The rise of Capita, the birth of a superpower. Hello everyone. In this video we are going to explore how and why Capita became the superpower that we know it to be. First, we should take a look at the early events of Capita and pre-industrial history. Firstly, let's look at a map. As you can see in red, there's Capita. It doesn't start much larger than any of the other nations, and if anything, other nations look much larger and in a much better position than it. But somehow, throughout all odds, Capita becomes a superpower. And it all starts because of one very specific event. You see here, Capita invades England very early on in history. And this has heavy ramifications. Although the causes of this event are heavily debated, and some just say it was a rash decision, it is clear that there were a few key causes. Firstly, the northern nation was not in a very strong position. They were not aggressive. They did not even seem able to defend themselves. And as such, the Capitans took notice and took advantage of this. Secondly, the Capitans wanted to expand their power and influence. There wasn't many resources for them in this, but what there was the ability to prove themselves on the world stage. Now the effects of this are very interesting. Firstly, Capita is solidified as a nation that is unafraid of initiating conflicts. We will see in the future that Capita continues this trend of starting fights. Capita also begins to build an empire as well as a sphere of influence, and this forces the bordering countries to take a choice. They can either take an aggressive posture against Capita and attempt to challenge them, or they can take a more submissive role and go along with what Capita does. And the final and most devastating effect is that the northern nation, which lost to England, is doomed to obscurity for the rest of history. They are worthless in the eyes of the other nations now, and they never redeem themselves. Next, let's take a look at this map. As you can see, a few of the countries have expanded a bit more, but these were not the result of wars. This was just some colonization that the countries did into unclaimed territories. However, if you look at this overlay, you can see two very clear bubbles, and these are two great spheres of influence. They are the Northern Alliance and the Southern Alliance. In the North, we see a few key characteristics develop. The members stay fairly separate, but they are also united against the South. The North really exists in opposition to the South. There are two key cities to take note of in the North. Berlin, which has a very large iron export. They mine a ton of iron and they rival some of the huge iron miners down in the south, as well as Stockholm, who's a trade powerhouse of the north, who was postured actually at one point to overtake Capita, but this never happens. In the Southern Alliance, we see these key characteristics. The members joined around Capita due to the previous show of power. They were kind of scared and they didn't want to get beat up. And of course, the key city is Capita, which became known as the trade hub of the world, and it was the first industrialized city. So these two spheres of influence gave rise to a Cold War. Now the nature of this Cold War is pretty straightforward. The two spheres naturally existed in opposition to one another, and as such, the Cold War was between these two. In the north, there was a lot of anti-Capitan sentiment due to the annexation of England, and naturally, other nations up there were worried that the same would happen to them. There was a lot of construction of military bases and overall military growth between every nation involved. However, no major fights actually occur. In fact, before any fighting begins, we see the end of the Cold War, which is primarily caused by industrialization. And what happens is a one-sided industrialization occurs in La Capita that changes the world's view of the city. Industrialization in La Capita offers jobs to people who lived in countries that weren't industrialized. For example, workers from the north saw job opportunities in La Capita. They'd come there, work for a day, come back home. They made money, La Capita made money, everyone was happy. And because of this, the north never actually industrializes, unlike La Capita, because the advantage that La Capita gave them was already so great that they never felt the need to industrialize themselves. This industrialization also causes La Capita to be at a major military advantage, and as such the North starts to back down and respect La Capita more. So to further understand why the Cold War was stopped by industrialization, we're going to look at the nature of early La Capitan industrialization. And what we see is that there's this cycle that benefits everyone involved. It starts with workers, usually foreign, who go out mining offshore. They dig up a variety of materials, oil, bones, metals, etc. And these materials get brought back, harvested, turned into manufactured goods, and then they're sold. This naturally generates profit. And as such, the profit goes back to some of the workers, and some of the profit goes into producing more goods. So through this cycle, the workers gain money, and La Capita gains money. And what this causes is a lot of foreign workers to come back into La Capita to work, taking growth away from their home nation and giving it to La Capita. This really was a very cheap and easy outsource of labor for La Capita, and it was immensely beneficial to their growth. This also encouraged further spending inside La Capita due to the influx of foreign workers who would purchase goods within the city itself. The current drawback of this system is that the goods produced are limited by the amount of workers available, so there's an upper limit if there's not enough workers that are interested. And we'll see later, La Capita finds a new way to tackle this issue. Around the same time of the early industrialization, we see another major development. If you take a look at this map, you can see that Africa has been colonized by many of the European nations. Most of the territory goes to La Capita and other members of its sphere of influence, but northerners do get some of it, and this will come crucial later. So this African colonization made a big step possible that really took La Capita from a power to a great power. And that is the Great African Railroad, which we'll get into later. Going back to colonization, due to the friendlier terms that all the European nations had after the Cold War, they split up the territory fairly equally and weren't upset about what they got. And everyone was actually very happy with what they got because it was very rich in resources that everyone needed. So, possibly the greatest achievement of this time period was the Great African Railroad, which was funded by French and German steel, and it spanned two directions, a north-south rail and an east-west rail. And this railroad fundamentally changed travel. It allowed for speeds that had never been before seen, as well as amounts of cargo to be shipped that had never happened before. All of a sudden, the trip from South Africa to La Capita was now faster than the trip from La Capita to Stockholm. And the effects of this are massive. It is the beginning of the late industrial cycle for La Capita, as well as it further united the southern nations as it was a collaborative project between them all. And it also cemented La Capita as the world trade hub, as now there were massive railroads that all led back to La Capita. We are now at the peak of La Capitan power, and we can't talk about the peak without mentioning the East, which is a major factor. The peak of La Capitan influence is largely due to the discovery and rise of two eastern nations. These nations worked together to jointly occupy a large swath of territory in Eastern Asia. And the Capitans saw these nations as a threat to their existence and way of life because these two nations had never had any contact with them before this point. So the way they lived, the way they built their societies was very different, and that scared them. They also kind of believed that the Eastern nations were expansionist due to some Middle Eastern expansion, but it really wasn't that much. So a massive military base was installed in the Middle East by Capita, and it hosted the largest collection of weaponry and intelligence to date. Capita actually put together a massive group to build this massive surveillance system of the entire known world. And with this, they used it to keep track of other nations and see what's going on. And another major factor of this Eastern rise is that the northern and southern nations unified much more as they found a common enemy to rally around. At this point, most of the Northern Alliance had already fully integrated into the Capitan sphere of influence, minus a few who already held grievances. But they became very close-knitted and actually gave each other military aid in preparation for the big war that was coming. And if you take a look at this map, you can see the jointly occupied territory, the homelands of the two territories, and also where they expanded in the east. Really not all that bad. And you can also see where Capita took some Middle Eastern territory as well to build their military base. And while we're talking about the East, we have to address the misconceptions about the East, because there are many. Due to propaganda from Capita during this time, there are many lasting misconceptions about the Eastern nations as a result of Capitan propaganda. Firstly, the Easterners were portrayed as aggressors, which there's no evidence of this happening, and if anything, the upcoming conflict was instigated by Capita. Capita accused the East of civilian atrocities, with locking civilians in jail cells underground. This was found to be partially true as jail cells were found, but there's also massive above-ground cities, and for the most part it seems like a majority of the population lived good lives. We don't know why those civilians were underground. The other factor is that these underground places were actually massive cities of their own right. And this ties into the third accusation, and that is the Capitan said the East has no culture, which was obviously false. And the Capita's reasoning was further obviously false because they blamed it on the buildings. They claimed the East didn't really build anything, and they were just kind of there, which is largely false because the Easterners actually built housing that was better than the Capitan housing, and they built larger buildings as well as their underground cities, which the Capita never had. If you take a look at this map, you'll see one major difference from previous maps. And that is, a part of the Middle East is now occupied by Capita, and this was formerly Eastern territory. So, let's enter the Middle Eastern crisis. Basically, a Capitan scout from the military base and a Eastern border guard met at their border in the Middle East, and the tensions were already really high at the time, and them seeing each other was very tense. And no one knows exactly what happened, but one looked at the other, one shot the other, you know how it goes, and fighting began. No one did die, but people were hit, people were hurt. It was not pretty. And the towns just south of the border in the Eastern Territory was raided and razed by the Capitans, and the city no longer existed after this conflict. And the fighting was so fast and so quick that the East kind of just pulled out, and they want to know more in the process. So they left, noped out. Here we are today. This concludes the Capitan rise to power and their days of power. After this, we see a great fall. Through expansion, industrialization, and trade, Capita cemented itself as not only a superpower, but the capital of the known world. Its influence was massive, and all the nations today still feel the effects of the basis that it set out, especially with the industrial concept. In my next video, we will go over the fall of La Capita, and you can see in this map the results of that, which are very interesting because although it's called the fall of La Capita, it actually gains territory through the process, but the power of the nation itself falls greatly, and it ends the era of La Capitan prosperity. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you found this helpful and informative.